Hey guys, welcome back to Planet Mithril Paints, and today we'll be rounding off our Gondor series by showing you how to paint the Citadel Guard of Gondor, elite infantry of Minas Tirith, standing defiant in the face of all odds. We'll be showing you how to paint these to keep them in line with your normal warriors of Minas Tirith, as well as detailing you the intricate trims and freehand design on the back of the cloak. So without further delay, please sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Start off by base coating the flesh with Bugman's Cloak. As the helmet shadows quite a lot of the face, we can get away without the interim layer stages for the face. Apply a layer now with Cadian Flesh Tone. Once the wash is dried, relayer with Cadian Flesh Tone, leaving the wash sitting around the mouth and the recesses of the eyes. Finally, apply a highlight with Kislev Flesh. This is brighter than our usual Cadian Flesh Tone Pallid Witch Flesh mix, so will stand out more within the dark recessed area of the helmet opening. Once you're happy with the skin, you can carefully paint the eyes using Abaddon Black and Pallid Witch Flesh, but this is a purely optional stage. Base coat the armour with a solid, even coat of lead belcher. This will be the basis for the Citadel Guard's armour, so try and make sure the application of this base coat is smooth and solid. We want to avoid the heavy washes removing any of the base coat when being applied. As the Citadel Guard are the elite infantry of Gondor, we want their armour to look slightly more well maintained than that of their warrior counterparts. We'll be diluting the following wash stages with approximately 25% Lamy medium to prevent the wash sticking to the model quite as virulently. Once both washes are dry and you're happy with the tone of the model, apply a fine edge highlight around all the armour plating with a mix of lead belcher and Pallid Witch Flesh. Keep your highlights as tight and thin as you can here to give the impression of sharpness and light reflecting off the more pronounced areas of the metals. Areas to take particular care with are the tree on the chest plate, edges of the folds, and separating out the ridges on the helmet. The Pallid Witch Flesh brings up the tone of the lead belcher in a more muted fashion and will prevent the highlights from looking overly garish and too vibrant if we were to use Ironbreaker or something similar. Paint in all the straps, belts and spear shaft with dried bark. Edge highlight all the straps with a mix of dried bark and baneblade brown. Carefully start drawing your brush down the shaft of the spear in thin, random lines to give the impression of wood grain. During this step it's crucial to try and maintain a good point on your brush to avoid any wayward splodges that may disrupt the effect. Carefully pick up the sword hilt, cape buckles and any other brass details with rune or brass. Once the wash is dried, apply a fine edge highlight to these areas with Canoptek alloy. Now we're going to tackle the cloak, gloves and cloth. We want to keep the cloak looking as dark in tone as possible to best reflect the visuals of the Citadel Guard from the films. To do this, we're going to start by applying a base coat with a mix of Abaddon Black and Eshin Grey, and keeping the concentration of Abaddon Black very high, so this base coat will look very similar in tone to the spray undercoat. But trust us here, we want the cloth base coat to be as dark as possible for the following layering and highlighting stages. Now we're going to apply an all-over layer to these areas by slightly increasing the amount of Eshin Grey to the base coat mix. You want to apply this in 2 or 3 thin coats here in order to maintain smooth, even coverage over the large flat areas. Once the wash is dry, reapply the previous mix as another layer, leaving the Nuln oil showing in the deepest recesses. Now the Citadel Guards don't have the most well-defined cloaks and folds in the material, so finding where these recesses are can prove tricky. Our best tip here is to hold the model under a directional light from above and use this as a guideline for where to apply this layer stage. Now we want to define some more of the pronounced upper folds of material and the gloves by adding slightly more etching grey to the mix to the first highlight stage. Here you can start separating out the fingers and defining the gloves, as well as pushing the definition of the folds and crests of material, keeping your highlights tighter than the previous layer stage and try and create a sense of flow and definition in a cloak that admittedly doesn't have a lot of inherent movement through it. The beauty is that if this stage proves too challenging, whether it's the lack of defined material or the dark tone of the paint we're currently using, the centre of the cloak doesn't have to have so much attention paid to it, as this is where we're going to be applying our freehand design later on down the line. We're covering it here, however, for those who do not want the Citadel Guard to have any freehand on the backs of their cloaks. Finally, apply thin edge highlight to all the cloth and gloves with pure Eshin grey. If the concentrations of Eshin throughout the previous stages have been gradual and added carefully, the result should give you a very nice looking cloak with a natural blended progression from the darkest undertone through to the edge highlights on the upper crests and folds of material. These parts of the model can be quite challenging to get right, and dry brushing all these stages works as a suitable alternative to define targeted highlights. Now we're going to work on the trims around the fold and edges of the cloak, a detail that is synonymous with the Citadel Guard of Gondor. Start off by base coating the waist trim and drawing a thin, fine line down the very edge of the cloak with Steel Legion drab. Be very careful here not to bleed onto the finished cloak. Keeping a steady hand and fine point to your brush is crucial. Apply a layer now with a mix of Steel Legion drab and Zamesi Desert. Now, highlight all the trims by adding in some pallid witch flesh to the previous mix. Continue to add in pallid witch flesh to the overall mix for the next few highlight stages, leaving the layer mix showing down the centre of the fold trim. With the cloak trim, you can start to focus more on the upper areas where the material bunches and down the bottom of the cloak. Now, with a thin brush, very carefully paint in the patterning across the fold trim. You can go for a concentric circular pattern, or as we did here, paint in thin, tiny crosses to give the impression of patterning and stitching across the trim. Any mistakes here can be easily touched up with the previous Steel Legion's messy pallid witch flesh mix, but be careful, as repeated touch-ups will lead to visible blemishes. Now, to tie the patterning in with the rest of the trim, apply an extreme edge highlight along the fold trim by adding even more pallid witch flesh to the overall mix. Now we've finished our model. If you're happy with the results, then go straight onto the basing phase and enjoy using the Citadel Guard on the tabletop. This freehand is purely optional and something we wanted to show for those of you who have asked how we replicated this across our Gondor army. There are a few things to consider before tackling this freehand. Firstly, make sure you have a reference picture open and to hand. Although the design may not look exactly like the image, as ours unfortunately didn't, it's still crucial to know exactly where every detail is to get the spacing and length of various areas as accurate as possible. Secondly, it's a good idea to have a clean water pot at this stage. As we'll be working with very light colours, we don't want to risk tainting the hue of the finished design with dirty water in the brush bristles. We're going to be keeping our paints here fairly well thinned down with Lamy and medium to try and keep the coverage as smooth as possible. Now this can be tricky to work with and will probably require a few applications over the whole design to get a solid colour. Take your time and do not rush. If at any point you start to feel frustrated, then step away for a short break and come back with fresh eyes. This design is very intricate and rushing will cause irregularities and blemishes which will spoil the overall look on the cloak. Using Rakarth flesh, carefully paint on the design on the reverse of the cloak. A good trick would be to map out various areas of the insignia with small dots where you want the design to be. This will prevent or at least minimise the risk of the design becoming warped. We also want it to look as symmetrical as possible on both sides of the main trunk. Now this can be tricky as some Citadel Guard sculpts have quite bunched up cloaks. We're showing you here on a large, flatter cloak so you can get a feel for how the design works. Once you're happy with the tree design, paint 7 individual stars above the tree, cascading down either side. Once you're happy with how the design looks on the cloak, you wouldn't believe it, but yes, there is an even more intricate stage to get done. But this is arguably a lot easier than the initial mapping out of the White Tree. With a brush with an extremely fine point, carefully trace around the outside of the tree trunk, branches and all the stars at the top with pallid witch flesh. We didn't portray it terribly well here, but try and keep your paint applications in long, unbroken lines as much as you can to create a smooth, natural finish. We recommend Artis Opus Series M size 00 fine detail brush for this particular stage, but any other fine detail brush of a similar size will work just as well as long as you maintain a fine point to the tip of your brush. There we have it, the Citadel Guard elite infantry of Gondor standing defiant against the forces of evil and guarding the hope that men once thought lost.